Hello. So these are space notes that I want you guys to take in your journals. And I created these notes last year when we first had to go home because of COVID. So you'll hear some references to things that referred to last year. So ignore those, but the notes are good. So take the notes. They all need to be in your journal. They will be graded. Miss Elliott, if you can just pause these as needed, it'll probably need to be paused after each description, and then there's a little bit of art history in there too. Please make sure to record the piece name, the artist, and the year created when we do have our test in a couple of weeks. They are fair game for being on the test. So take a look at all of the notes. I will be in later. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay, so get your journals, get your pencils, and get ready to take some notes. Let's get started. The definition of space. Space is the area around, within, or between images or elements. There are 6 ways to make 3-dimensional drawings and to give the illusion of depth and space. These help to deceive the viewer's eyes and show non-existent spaces. Let's look at each of these techniques. Use overlapping images to create a form of dimension and space. In this piece by Renoir, entitled Les Moulins de Galette, you see his use of overlaying the images of people. By staggering them and overlaying them from the foreground to the background, he creates an immediate sense of depth. By shading images, you use light and shadow to create the illusion of form and space. The Girl with the Pearl Earring, painted by Johann Vermeer in 1665, is a perfect demonstration of using shading to create space in a piece. By using light and shadow, he is able to set her apart from the dark background, and she fills the space completely. With placement, objects that are higher in the picture appear to be in the distance. In this painting, by Jan van Eyck, painted 1434, he uses placement in order to demonstrate distance. If you look at the light fixture in the back, it is clearly larger than the man and the woman's head. However, it doesn't feel like it's front and center. Because it's the highest on the painting, it gives the impression of the distance. Using size to create space, small objects look distant, while closer objects are larger. This painting, called Christina's World, painted by Andrew Wyeth in 1948, is a perfect example of size. In our last painting by Van Eyck, you also had a size element. The 2 main people are significantly larger than everything else. So size was definitely at play in that piece as well. But for Wyeth's painting, the woman sits in the foreground and the house sits in the background. She looks onward at the house. The house is significantly smaller, and it's at the top of the page. So both size and placement are playing a part in these paintings, but they both work together to add to the feeling of space and the feeling of distance. With value and focus, Lighter values and less details suggest distant objects. This piece by Velázquez is probably one of my favorite pieces. He demonstrates value and focus in this because there's a value change from the highlighted people in the front to the darkness of the back of the room. The pieces, the paintings on the wall are huge, but they don't feel like they're in the foreground because of their value change. Also, they lose detail and focus, and so that also helps to add to their distance and space. And using linear perspective, the parallel lines create space by going toward their vanishing points. In Edvard Munch's piece, The Scream, he uses linear perspective through the use of the railing, the deck that he's walking on, to paint from the foreground to the background. The linear perspective goes back and space is created. Okay, guys, this is my in one take notes on space number 2. Okay, so how do we create space? Here's your definition, or another idea of creating space, keeping in mind your composition. Your layout, your placement of objects affect how they feel in their space. So when you are creating space in a piece, you need to keep in mind where you put your objects, how the eye follows. Like when I'm doing a layout design for a graphic project, I always want to make sure that I'm moving my images, my text or my images in a place that's going to help the eye follow along. So think through that. Okay, here are a couple techniques that we've kind of gone over, but we'll hit in a different way. Drawing big. By drawing an object big, you're drawing the eye to it. You can either keep that object isolated, like my flower here is just a simple object, but if I added something behind it and I had it kind of in that blurry, creating that lack of focus in the background, then it adds an element of space and depth that, it's like portrait mode on your iPhone, right? So you have the up close thing, nice and big, and then the background blurry. Filling the whole paper or canvas or whatever surface you're creating, by filling the whole space, you're creating an area for the eye to move around. And this is, again, when composition really becomes an issue. And you need to consider your composition. You want to create space for your whole area to move. Or for your eye to move throughout the whole piece. Okay, so the next technique is lines off the paper. When you draw big, you're kind of doing lines off the paper anyway. But by not having an item enclosed in the space, it's very popular now in more of a minimalist kind of fashion to have items isolated on a page, and that's one look. But what you get with that look is more of a flat, simplistic, minimalistic kind of look, which is fine. It has a place for that. There's definitely a place for that. But in creating space, that doesn't work, because what you're defining by that kind of minimalistic look is more of a positive and negative space than an actual movement of the eye through a piece. So by doing lines off the paper, you're actually creating much more of a movement. The eye has lines to follow, things hang off. So like I have the example of like the mug and the book and the pencil, and that's all crossing off of the page line. Now, placement in relation to the horizon line. This is something that you play with depending on your piece. Like Cherish, you did a piece with the horizon line with your monochromatic piece. How you place your horizon line just lends to the feeling of space based on how the viewer is seeing it. So for instance, a lower horizon line is going to make a viewer feel like they are already up high. A higher horizon line is going to make them feel like they're lower in it. So there's all different ways of using horizon line. Horizon line can be utilized in different ways depending on what you're portraying. Most often you kind of see it on the upper half, just a little bit over halfway. That's most often where you'll see horizon lines in pieces. But how you utilize horizon line just adds to the element of space and the movement of the eye through the piece. Okay, so lastly, we need to understand foreground, middle ground, background. Honestly, I think you guys probably already know this. I don't think we need to spend too much time on it. It just is important that as you are creating pieces, especially if you're doing landscapes of any kind, that you have an understanding of the foreground, the midground, and the background, and how they're utilized. Understanding how they all need to stagger in their spacing. So you don't want to have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background that are going to be the same size, because that is boring to the eye. So the foreground is the area closest to the viewer. Obviously, the middle ground is the area between the foreground and the background, and then the background is the area farthest from the viewer. You can pause me and write that down. The foreground is the area closest to the viewer, the midground is the area between the fore and the back, and the background is the area farthest from the viewer. So, to create interest in your artwork, you should vary these in size. Don't keep the angling of how they interact with one another different. Their visual interest is created by altering how they're layered and what's going on within each section. Also, remember, we've talked about this in class, foreground is going to most often be darker, whereas your background is most often going to be lighter. Unless you're doing something where you're trying to toss it up and for visual interest, play with how that plays out. The foreground should be darker, the midground should be kind of in the middle, and your background should be the grayest, the lightest in tone. Okay? Okay, so one other thing is positive and negative space. You need to have these notes in your journal as well. Positive space refers to the main focus of a picture. Negative space refers to the background. All right, all. That's it. Thanks.